Welcome to the quiet hours of curiosity, where we tell the stories that shaped us long before we had words to tell them ourselves. Whether you're here to drift off to sleep, focus on work, or simply let your mind wander through deep time, you've found the right place. This is where we explore the slow, patient forces that carved humanity into what we are today. Welcome back to Sleepless Homo Sapien. If this kind of thoughtful, evidence-based storytelling helps you learn something new, or simply provides a calm companion for your evening, consider subscribing. It's a small gesture that helps more curious minds discover this space for long-form, science-grounded exploration. No rushed conclusions, no wild speculation, just the humble attempt to understand our ancestors through what they left behind. And if you drift off at some point, no worries at all. There are timestamps in the description, so tomorrow you can pick up exactly where the ice and time left off. Now let's step back, way back, to a world so cold and strange that if you could visit it, you might not recognize Earth at all. Imagine standing on what is now the coast of New York, but instead of skyscrapers piercing the sky, there's a wall of ice stretching higher than you can see, a glacier thick as a mountain laid sideways, grinding slowly southward, carrying boulders the size of houses like they were pebbles. The ocean is 300 feet lower than it is today. You could walk from England to France without getting your feet wet. Siberia and Alaska are connected by a bridge of frozen land wider than Texas. This is Earth during the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago. And somewhere in this alien landscape, small bands of humans are not just surviving, they're adapting in ways that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of our species. Because what we're about to explore isn't just how ice shaped the land, it's how ice shaped us. The story begins long before the glaciers reached their peak. Around 70,000 years ago, Earth's climate began its slow descent into one of the most severe ice ages our planet has ever known. But this wasn't a sudden freeze. Climate doesn't work that way. Instead, it was a gradual tightening, a planetary breath held for millennia, as temperatures dropped and ice began to claim more and more of the northern continents. The mechanics are elegant in their simplicity. Earth's orbit around the Sun isn't perfectly circular, and our planet's tilt shifts over tens of thousands of years. These tiny astronomical wobbles, called Milankovitch cycles, determine how much sunlight reaches different parts of Earth during different seasons. When the northern hemisphere receives less summer sunshine, snow that falls in winter doesn't fully melt. Year after year, it accumulates. Compacts, becomes ice, and ice, once it starts growing, feeds on itself. Here's why. Fresh snow reflects about 90% of the sun's energy back into space, but dark soil and vegetation absorb that same energy as heat. So as ice sheets expand, they create their own cooling effect, reflecting more sunlight away from Earth's surface. The planet grows colder, which allows the ice to spread further, which reflects even more sunlight. It's a feedback loop that can transform a planet. By the time we reach the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, ice sheets covered most of Canada, reached down into what is now the northern United States, and stretched across Scandinavia and northern Russia. These weren't just thick patches of snow. These were ice sheets, over a mile thick in places, so heavy they pressed the very continents down into the Earth's mantle. But the ice was only part of the story. As water became locked up in these massive glaciers, sea levels dropped dramatically. Coastlines that had been underwater for millions of years suddenly became dry land. The Bering Land Bridge emerged, connecting Asia and North America. The English Channel vanished, making Britain part of continental Europe. Indonesia became a single massive continent called Sunda Australia, and New Guinea merged into one landmass. For the humans living through this transformation, the world was becoming both smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because oceans that had once separated continents were now crossable on foot. Larger because vast new territories were opening up, landscapes that had never felt human footsteps. But this wasn't a world of endless opportunity. It was a world of brutal selection pressure. and that pressure was about to forge our species in ways we're only beginning to understand. The human populations that entered this ice age were already remarkable. They had mastered fire, developed complex tools, created art, and spread across Africa and into Asia. But the ice age would test every adaptation they had developed and demand new ones they had never needed before. First came the cold itself, not just winter cold, but cold that lasted for generations. Average global temperatures dropped by about 10 degrees Celsius. In the regions closest to the ice sheets, temperatures plummeted even further. This wasn't weather you could simply wait out. This was climate you had to adapt to or die. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of innovation driven by necessity. In what is now the Czech Republic, at a site called Dolní Věstonice, humans 26,000 years ago were building shelters using mammoth bones as structural supports, covering them with hides and sod for insulation. These weren't crude lean-tos, they were engineered dwellings designed to hold heat and withstand months of sub-zero temperatures. The tools changed too. Stone blades became longer, thinner, more efficient. Composite tools appeared, with multiple materials bound together to create implements more effective than anything made from a single material. Atlatls, or spear throwers, gave hunters greater range and power. Bone needles allowed for the creation of fitted clothing, crucial for survival in extreme cold. But perhaps most importantly, social structures began to evolve. The small family groups that had characterized earlier human societies began to form larger, more complex networks. Trade routes emerged, carrying high-quality stone and other materials across hundreds of miles. At Sungir in Russia, burials from 28,000 years ago show children interred with thousands of mammoth ivory beads, suggesting not just individual wealth, but community investment in symbolic display. This social complexity wasn't luxury, it was survival strategy. In a world where resources were scarce and unpredictable, having relationships with distant groups could mean the difference between starvation and sustenance. Information networks became as important as tool networks. Knowing where the herds were, which routes were passable, where fresh water could be found. These weren't just advantages. They were lifelines. The Ice Age also created new ecological niches that humans learned to exploit. The Mammoth Steppe, a cold grassland ecosystem that stretched from Western Europe to eastern Siberia and into Alaska, supported massive herds of megafauna. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, giant bison, cave bears. These weren't just occasional hunting targets. For some human groups, they became the foundation of entire cultures. Evidence from sites like Mezherish in Ukraine shows that humans weren't just hunting these massive animals, they were organising their entire seasonal cycles around them. The bones weren't just meat, they were building materials, fuel, tools. Mammoth fat provided light and heat. Mammoth hide became shelter and clothing. Even mammoth dung dried and stored served as fuel when wood was scarce. But this specialisation came with risks. When you build your entire way of life around mammoth hunting, what happens when the mammoths disappear? That question would become urgent as the Ice Age progressed, because the same climate pressures that were shaping human culture were also driving evolutionary changes in the animals they depended on, and in the humans themselves. The genetic evidence from this period reveals something remarkable. The extreme conditions of the Ice Age created what population geneticists call bottleneck effects. Small isolated groups of humans faced environmental pressures so severe that only those with certain genetic advantages survived to reproduce. Some of these adaptations are still with us today. Populations that lived in northern latitudes developed genetic variants that improved their ability to produce vitamin D from limited sunlight. Others evolved better cold tolerance, more efficient metabolism, or enhanced immune responses to the diseases that thrived in crowded winter shelters. But the most profound changes weren't necessarily genetic. They were cultural, because the Ice Age didn't just test individual survival, it tested the survival of information. In a world where the wrong decision could kill your entire group, the ability to accumulate, preserve, and transmit knowledge became perhaps the most important human adaptation of all. This is where the story becomes truly extraordinary, because as we'll see, the humans who emerged from the Ice Age weren't just survivors, they were carriers of something unprecedented in Earth's history. A form of evolution that operated not through genes alone, but through ideas, technologies, and social innovations that could be passed down and improved upon across generations. The mammoth hunters of Siberia were developing techniques for working ivory that wouldn't be matched until the Renaissance. The reindeer herders of northern Europe were creating astronomical calendars carved in bone. The cave artists of France and Spain were producing works of such sophistication that when they were first discovered, many scientists refused to believe they were ancient. Something was happening to the human mind during the Ice Age, something that would prove far more important than any physical adaptation. But to understand what that was, we need to look more closely at how these scattered bands of Ice Age humans were actually living, day by day, season by season, in a world that was colder and stranger than anything we can easily imagine today. And that's where our story really begins to get interesting, because the ice wasn't just changing the landscape, it was changing the very nature of what it meant to be human. The transformation wasn't visible from day to day. You couldn't wake up one morning and notice that your world had fundamentally shifted. But over the span of generations, something unprecedented was taking root in the scattered camps and shelters where humans huddled against the cold. The Ice Age wasn't just selecting for physical traits that could withstand the freeze, it was selecting for minds that could think their way through problems no human had ever faced before. Consider what daily life actually looked like for a band of hunters following reindeer herds across the tundra of what is now northern Germany 15,000 years ago. The sun barely rises above the horizon, casting everything in a perpetual twilight that lasts for months. The ground is frozen solid to depths that would require modern machinery to penetrate. Every calorie burned staying warm is a calorie that can't be used for hunting, gathering, or the endless maintenance that keeps primitive technology functional. In this environment, intelligence isn't just an advantage, it's the difference between your lineage continuing and your lineage ending in the snow. The archaeological sites from this period reveal just how sophisticated these solutions became. At Gunnersdorf in the Rhine Valley, dating to around 12,000 years ago, excavations have uncovered what can only be described as an outdoor workshop complex. Stone tool production areas are carefully separated from food processing zones. Bone and antler working stations are positioned to take advantage of the best light. Storage pits are dug at precise angles to prevent freezing while maintaining access. This wasn't random organisation, this was systematic thinking, applied to survival. Someone had figured out the optimal workflow for transforming raw materials into the tools that kept people alive, and then they had taught that system to others, who improved upon it and passed it on again. But the real revolution was happening inside human skulls. The constant pressure of Ice Age survival was rewarding a very specific type of thinking, the ability to model complex systems in your mind before committing resources to them in the real world. If you're planning a mammoth hunt, you can't afford to get it wrong. A single mistake means not just a failed hunt, but potentially the death of hunters who can't be replaced. So you have to think through every variable: wind direction and how it will affect scent, migration patterns and how they intersect with terrain, the behaviour of the herd when threatened, the coordination required among hunters, the tools needed for different phases of the hunt, the processing of meat that must happen quickly before it spoils or attracts scavengers. This kind of planning requires what cognitive scientists call working memory, the ability to hold multiple pieces of information in your mind simultaneously while manipulating them to solve problems. And the genetic evidence suggests that Ice Age humans were developing enhanced working memory capacity at an unprecedented rate. Studies of ancient DNA from European populations show that genes associated with brain development and neural connectivity were under strong positive selection during the Ice Age. Variants that improved cognitive flexibility, pattern recognition, and social learning were spreading through populations faster than random genetic drift could account for. Natural selection was literally reshaping the human brain, but genes alone don't explain what was happening, because the most remarkable innovations of the Ice Age weren't just technological, they were social, and they reveal a form of collective intelligence that may have been the most important evolutionary development in Earth's history. Take the phenomenon that archaeologists call the Magdalenian culture, which flourished across Western Europe between 17 and 12,000 years ago. These weren't isolated bands scraping out a subsistence existence. They were part of trade networks that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Russian steppes. Amber from the Baltic Sea appears in caves in southern France. Flint from specific quarries in Belgium shows up in archaeological sites hundreds of miles away. Marine shells from the Mediterranean are found in inland settlements that had no direct access to the sea. This wasn't occasional contact. This was systematic exchange that required long-term planning, standardized measures of value, and sophisticated understanding of geography across vast distances. Someone had to figure out which materials were worth trading, how to transport them across dangerous terrain, and how to maintain relationships with groups they might only encounter once or twice a year. More remarkably, these trade networks seem to have been carrying more than just physical goods. They were carrying information. Tool technologies that originated in one region appear simultaneously across the entire network. Artistic styles spread faster than human migration could account for. Even specific hunting techniques show up in archaeological sites, separated by thousands of miles and connected only by these invisible threads of trade and communication. The Ice Age was creating the first truly global human culture, not global in the sense of worldwide, but global in the sense of interconnected systems of knowledge and technology that transcended local environments and extended across entire continents. And this is where the story takes a turn that even the humans living through it couldn't have anticipated. Because around 15,000 years ago, the ice began to retreat. It didn't happen quickly. Climate change, even dramatic climate change, operates on timescales that make individual human lives seem brief. But for populations that had spent thousands of years adapting to Ice Age conditions, even gradual warming created cascading changes that rippled through every aspect of their existence. The megafauna that had supported entire cultures began to disappear, not all at once but steadily, as the ecosystems they depended on shifted and fragmented. The mammoth steppe, that vast grassland that had stretched across the northern continents, began breaking up into smaller patches, separated by forests and wetlands. The massive herds that had provided predictable sources of meat, bone and hide became smaller, more scattered, less reliable. For human populations that had built their entire way of life around hunting these animals, this presented an existential crisis. Do you follow the herds as they retreat northward into increasingly marginal territory? Do you adapt to hunting smaller, more dispersed game? Do you develop entirely new subsistence strategies? Different groups chose different solutions. Some followed the retreating ice, maintaining their traditional lifestyles for as long as possible. Archaeological sites in northern Scandinavia show that reindeer hunting cultures persisted there until relatively recent times, preserving Ice Age technologies and social structures long after they had disappeared elsewhere. But other populations made a choice that would reshape human history. Instead of following the herds or adapting to hunt different animals, they began to focus more intensively on plant resources, and not just gathering wild plants, but actively managing them, encouraging their growth, protecting them from competitors. This wasn't agriculture as we know it today. It was something subtler and perhaps more sophisticated, a form of landscape management that worked with natural systems rather than replacing them. Evidence from sites across the Middle East shows that humans were selectively harvesting wild grains, burning forests to encourage the growth of useful plants, and even transplanting species to locations where they would be more accessible. The cognitive skills that Ice Age humans had developed for tracking animals and coordinating hunts turned out to be perfectly suited for understanding plant ecology and managing complex agricultural systems. The working memory that allowed them to model mammoth behaviour could just as easily model the interactions between different plant species. The social networks that had carried information about hunting grounds could carry information about growing seasons and soil management. But this transition wasn't just about food production, it was about a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with the environment. For the first time in our species' history, humans weren't just adapting to their surroundings, they were actively reshaping those surroundings to better suit their needs. The psychological implications of this shift are staggering. When you can control your food supply, you can plan further into the future. When you can modify your environment, you begin to see yourself not as a part of nature, but as separate from it. When you can accumulate surplus resources, you can support individuals who specialize in activities other than food production. These changes were happening simultaneously across different parts of the world as the Ice Age ended. In the Middle East, wild wheat and barley were being domesticated. In China, rice cultivation was beginning. In the Americas, squash and beans were being selectively bred. In New Guinea, bananas and other tree crops were being managed in sophisticated agroforestry systems. The remarkable thing is that these developments were happening independently. There's no evidence that agricultural techniques were spreading from one region to another through trade or migration. Instead, human populations around the world were arriving at similar solutions to similar problems at roughly the same time. This suggests that the cognitive evolution that had occurred during the Ice Age had prepared our species for this transition. The enhanced working memory, pattern recognition, and social learning abilities that had been selected for during the coldest millennia were now being applied to entirely new challenges, and they were proving remarkably adaptable. But the transition out of the Ice Age also created new forms of selection pressure. Populations that successfully made the shift to food production could support larger communities, accumulate more resources, and develop more complex technologies. Those that couldn't were gradually displaced or absorbed. Within just a few thousand years, the mobile hunting bands that had characterized human society for hundreds of thousands of years were becoming increasingly rare. In their place were settled communities, then towns, then cities. The surplus food production that agriculture made possible supported craftsmen, priests, warriors, and eventually kings. The Ice Age had ended, but its legacy was just beginning to unfold. The cognitive adaptations that had allowed humans to survive the coldest period in our planet's recent history were now powering an explosion of cultural complexity that would transform Earth itself. And yet something was also being lost. The intimate knowledge of natural systems that had allowed Ice Age humans to thrive in the world's harshest environments was becoming less necessary as humans created increasingly artificial environments for themselves. The social networks that had once carried vital survival information were being replaced by hierarchical systems of control and authority. The end of the Ice Age marked not just a change in climate, but a fundamental transformation in what it meant to be human. We were becoming something new, something unprecedented in Earth's history. But whether that transformation represented progress or loss, gain or sacrifice, remains one of the most profound questions we face as a species. Because the humans who emerged from the Ice Age weren't just survivors of Earth's last great climate crisis. They were the architects of everything that would follow. The cities, the technologies, the art, the wars, the discoveries, the dreams, all of it flowed from the cognitive revolution that had taken place in the minds of our ancestors as they huddled around fires, crafted tools, and told stories through the longest, coldest night in human memory. The transformation wasn't immediate, and it wasn't uniform. Across the thawing landscapes of Europe, Asia, and the Americas, different human populations were experimenting with radically different approaches to survival in a warming world. Some clung to the old ways, following the retreating herds northward into the shrinking territories where Ice Age life could still persist. Others embraced change so completely that within a few generations their descendants would barely recognize the world their ancestors had known. But perhaps the most profound shift wasn't in what humans were doing. It was in how they were thinking about time itself. For hundreds of thousands of years, human consciousness had been shaped by the rhythms of immediate survival. You tracked animals that were present now. You gathered plants that were ripe today. You made tools for tasks you needed to accomplish this season. Even the most sophisticated Ice Age planning rarely extended beyond a single annual cycle. The end of the Ice Age changed that fundamental relationship with temporality. When you plant seeds, you're making a bet on a future that extends months into uncertainty. When you clear land and build permanent structures, you're committing not just yourself, but your children to a particular place and way of life. When you begin to accumulate surplus resources, you're creating the possibility of supporting people whose contributions won't be felt until years or even decades later. This expansion of temporal thinking had cascading effects throughout human societies. Language itself began to evolve new tenses, new ways of describing hypothetical futures and distant pasts. Oral traditions became more complex, carrying not just practical information, but elaborate genealogies, mythologies, and cosmologies that stretched back to the beginning of time and forward to imagined ends of the world. The archaeological evidence for this cognitive shift is subtle but unmistakable. At sites like Göbekli Tepe, in what is now Turkey, dating to around 11,000 years ago, we find massive stone circles that required coordinated labour from hundreds of people over multiple generations. These weren't practical structures in any immediate sense. They were investments in symbolic meaning that could only make sense to minds capable of thinking decades or centuries into the future. The artwork from this period tells a similar story. The naturalistic animal paintings that characterized Ice Age cave art began giving way to increasingly abstract symbols, geometric patterns, and representations of concepts rather than concrete objects. Human figures appear more frequently, but they're often stylized, ritualized, shown in contexts that seem more mythological than documentary. This shift toward abstraction wasn't just aesthetic, it reflected a fundamental change in how humans were categorizing and understanding their world. Instead of thinking primarily in terms of immediate sensory experience, they were developing mental models based on relationships, hierarchies, and systems that couldn't be directly observed. The social implications were revolutionary. For the first time in human history, it became possible to organize large groups of people around shared beliefs rather than just shared immediate needs. Religious systems, political hierarchies, and economic institutions all became possible once humans could conceive of abstract authorities and obligations that transcended face-to-face relationships. But this cognitive revolution came with costs that we're still grappling with today. The same mental flexibility that allowed humans to imagine complex social systems also made it possible to categorize other humans as fundamentally different, as members of outgroups who didn't deserve the same consideration as members of one's own community. The archaeological record from the post-Ice Age period shows increasing evidence of organised violence between human groups, not the small-scale conflicts that had occasionally erupted between competing bands of hunters, but systematic warfare involving coordinated attacks, defensive fortifications, and the deliberate targeting of entire communities. At the same time, within communities we begin to see the emergence of social stratification on a scale unknown during the Ice Age. Burial sites reveal dramatic differences in the treatment of the dead, with some individuals interred with vast quantities of valuable goods, while others were buried with nothing at all. Living sites show similar patterns, with some dwellings far larger and more elaborate than others. These changes weren't simply the result of some groups accumulating more resources than others. They reflected a fundamental shift in how humans thought about social relationships. The egalitarian ethos that had characterized most Ice Age societies, where leadership was situational and resources were shared according to need, was giving way to systems based on inherited status, accumulated wealth, and institutionalized authority. The transition was neither smooth nor inevitable. Many post-Ice Age societies experimented with different forms of organization, and the archaeological record shows numerous examples of communities that maintained relatively egalitarian structures even as they adopted agricultural technologies and settled lifestyles. But the overall trajectory was clear. The cognitive abilities that had allowed humans to survive the Ice Age were now being channeled into creating increasingly complex and hierarchical societies. The same mental flexibility that had once been used to track mammoth herds across vast territories was now being applied to managing agricultural surpluses, organizing labor forces, and maintaining control over large populations. Perhaps most significantly, humans were beginning to modify their environments on a scale that went far beyond anything seen during the Ice Age. Forest clearance for agriculture created entirely new landscapes. The domestication of animals led to the development of pastoral societies that transformed vast grasslands. River systems were diverted for irrigation, fundamentally altering regional hydrology. These environmental modifications weren't just practical adaptations. They were expressions of a new relationship between humans and the natural world, one based on the assumption that nature existed primarily as a resource to be exploited rather than a system to be understood and worked with. The psychological implications of this shift were profound. Ice Age humans had lived in a world where their survival depended on intimate knowledge of natural systems and careful attention to environmental feedback. Post-Ice Age humans increasingly lived in artificial environments of their own creation, insulated from the immediate consequences of their actions by layers of technology and social organization. This insulation made possible unprecedented achievements in art, science, and philosophy. But it also created a dangerous disconnect between human decision-making and ecological reality. For the first time in our species' history, it became possible for humans to make choices that seemed rational from a short-term social perspective, but were ultimately destructive from a long-term environmental perspective. The genetic evidence from this period reveals another fascinating dimension of the transformation. As human populations grew larger and more sedentary, they became subject to new forms of natural selection. Diseases that had been rare in small mobile hunting bands became major selective pressures in crowded agricultural communities. Genetic variants that provided resistance to infectious diseases spread rapidly through populations. At the same time, the physical demands of agricultural life selected for different traits than had been advantageous during the Ice Age. The lean, highly mobile physiques that had characterized Ice Age hunters gave way to more robust builds, better suited to repetitive agricultural labor. Digestive systems evolved to better process the grain-heavy diets that agriculture made possible. But perhaps most intriguingly, there's evidence that the intense social complexity of post-Ice Age societies was selecting for new forms of cognitive ability. Genetic variants associated with social cognition, language processing, and the ability to navigate complex hierarchical relationships appear to have been under strong positive selection during this period. In other words, the end of the Ice Age didn't just change how humans lived, it changed what humans were becoming, both culturally and biologically. The selection pressures that had shaped our species for hundreds of thousands of years were being replaced by entirely new pressures created by the artificial environments humans were constructing for themselves. This feedback loop between cultural innovation and biological evolution accelerated as post-Ice Age societies became more complex. Technologies that initially developed as solutions to immediate practical problems began taking on lives of their own, creating new challenges that required further innovations to address. The development of metallurgy, for example, began as a way to create more effective tools and weapons. But it also required new forms of social organization to coordinate mining, smelting, and distribution. These organizational innovations, in turn, made possible even more complex technologies, which required even more sophisticated social systems to manage. Within just a few thousand years of the Ice Age's end, human societies had become so complex that no individual could fully understand how they worked. The intimate, face-to-face relationships that had characterized Ice Age bands gave way to vast networks of strangers connected by abstract systems of exchange, authority, and belief. This transition represented perhaps the most dramatic transformation in the history of life on Earth. Never before had a single species so rapidly and completely altered both its own nature and the nature of the planet it inhabited. The cognitive abilities that had evolved to help small bands of humans survive in Ice Age environments were now being applied to challenges of unprecedented scale and complexity. Yet even as human societies became increasingly sophisticated, they remained dependent on the same basic biological and psychological systems that had evolved during hundreds of thousands of years of hunter-gatherer existence. The brains that were now grappling with abstract mathematics and complex social hierarchies were still essentially Ice Age brains, adapted for life in small groups facing immediate physical challenges. This mismatch between ancient psychology and modern challenges created tensions that continue to shape human behavior today. The same cognitive biases that had helped Ice Age humans make quick decisions in life or death situations often led post-Ice Age humans to make choices that were counterproductive in complex social environments. The tendency to favour immediate rewards over long-term benefits, for example, had been adaptive when resources were scarce and the future was uncertain. But in societies with surplus resources and complex planning requirements, this same tendency could lead to decisions that undermined long-term stability and prosperity. Similarly, the strong in-group preferences that had helped Ice Age bands maintain cohesion in hostile environments became sources of conflict and inequality in larger, more diverse societies. The same psychological mechanisms that had once promoted cooperation within small groups now often promoted competition and hostility between larger social categories. Understanding these deep evolutionary roots of human behavior became crucial for anyone trying to navigate the increasingly complex social landscapes that emerged in the millennia following the Ice Age. The most successful post-Ice Age societies were often those that found ways to channel ancient psychological tendencies toward constructive ends, rather than simply trying to suppress them. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this entire transformation was how quickly it occurred. In evolutionary terms, the transition from Ice Age hunter-gatherers to complex agricultural societies happened in the blink of an eye. The same species that had spent hundreds of thousands of years perfecting the skills needed to track mammoth herds across frozen tundra was suddenly building cities, developing writing systems, and creating works of art and architecture that still inspire awe today. This rapid transformation wasn't just a testament to human adaptability, it was evidence of something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. The emergence of a form of evolution that operated not through genetic changes alone, but through the accumulation and transmission of cultural information across generations. The Ice Age had created the cognitive foundations for this cultural evolution by selecting for enhanced working memory, pattern recognition, and social learning abilities. But the end of the Ice Age provided the environmental conditions that allowed these abilities to be applied to entirely new domains, creating feedback loops between cultural innovation and social complexity that accelerated change at an unprecedented pace. The result was a species that had become, in a very real sense, the architects of its own evolution. No longer simply subject to the blind forces of natural selection, humans had developed the ability to consciously direct their own development through cultural choices and technological innovations. This power came with responsibilities that our Ice Age ancestors could never have imagined. The same abilities that made it possible to create civilizations also made it possible to destroy them. The same technologies that could support millions of people could also damage the environmental systems that all life depended on. As we'll see, learning to navigate these new responsibilities would become one of the defining challenges of human existence in the post-Ice Age world. The cognitive revolution that had begun in the frozen camps of mammoth hunters would ultimately determine not just the fate of our species, but the fate of the entire planet. The weight of that transformation still echoes in our bones today. Because what emerged from the melting ice wasn't just a new way of organising human societies. It was a new form of consciousness itself, one that could conceive of problems and solutions on scales that no Ice Age mind had ever needed to contemplate. Consider what it meant to be the first human who looked at a wild grass and imagined it growing in rows, not just gathering what nature provided, but actively reshaping the living world to serve human purposes. This wasn't simply a technological leap, it was a psychological revolution that required minds capable of thinking in abstractions that had no immediate physical reference. The archaeological evidence from sites like Abu Huraira in Syria, dating to around 13,000 years ago, reveals this transition in startling detail. In the earliest layers, we find the scattered remains of wild gazelle hunts and gathered plant foods, the familiar signature of mobile hunter-gatherer life. But in the upper layers, something unprecedented appears, the bones of the same gazelle species, but now showing signs of deliberate management. Young males culled at specific ages, females maintained in proportions that suggest selective breeding. These weren't wild animals being hunted, they were becoming something that had never existed before in Earth's history, domestic livestock, and the transformation wasn't happening to the animals alone, it was happening to the humans who were managing them. The daily routine of animal husbandry required forms of attention and planning that were fundamentally different from the episodic intensity of Ice Age hunting. Instead of the sharp focus needed to track a mammoth herd across dozens of miles, domestic animal management demanded consistent, repetitive attention to the small details that maintained health and productivity over months and years. This shift toward routine, systematic thinking had profound implications for human consciousness. The seasonal rhythms that had structured Ice Age life gave way to daily schedules of feeding, milking, and monitoring. Time itself became more granular, measured not just in the broad cycles of migration and weather, but in the incremental changes that marked the growth of crops and the maturation of livestock. But the most significant change was happening in how humans thought about causation. Ice Age minds had been exquisitely attuned to reading the immediate relationships between cause and effect in natural systems. The angle of animal tracks in mud revealed the direction and speed of movement. The colour of leaves indicated the nutritional content of plants. The behaviour of birds signalled changes in weather patterns. Agricultural thinking required a different kind of causal reasoning, one that could trace connections across much longer time periods and through much more complex chains of interaction. The decision to plant seeds in a particular location had to take into account soil quality, drainage patterns, sun exposure, and protection from animals. but it also had to consider factors that might not become relevant for months: the timing of rains, the likelihood of floods, the availability of labour for harvest. This expansion of causal thinking beyond immediate sensory experience was perhaps the most important cognitive development in human history. It made possible not just agriculture, but all the forms of long-term planning that would characterise complex societies: architecture that could last for generations, trade relationships that spanned continents, religious and philosophical systems that attempted to explain the entire structure of reality. The neurological evidence for this transformation is subtle but compelling. Brain scans of modern humans show that the neural networks involved in long-term planning and abstract reasoning are significantly more developed than those found in our closest primate relatives. But more intriguingly, these same networks show the greatest activity when people are engaged in the kinds of tasks that would have been central to early agricultural life: coordinating group activities, managing resources over time, and thinking about hypothetical future scenarios. This suggests that the cognitive abilities we now consider most distinctively human may have been shaped not by the dramatic challenges of Ice Age survival, but by the seemingly mundane requirements of managing domestic plants and animals. The mind that could envision the harvest while planting the seed was the same mind that would eventually conceive of mathematics, literature, and philosophy. But this cognitive evolution came with trade-offs that we're still grappling with today. The same mental flexibility that made abstract thinking possible also made it easier for humans to lose touch with the immediate, physical realities that had once constrained their behaviour. Ice Age humans couldn't ignore environmental feedback because their survival depended on constant attention to natural systems. But agricultural humans could create artificial environments that buffered them from the immediate consequences of their actions. For the first time in our species' history, it became possible to make decisions based on abstract principles rather than direct sensory experience. This abstraction was both liberating and dangerous. It made possible unprecedented achievements in art, science, and social organisation, but it also created the possibility of systematic errors in judgment, mistakes that could compound over time until they threatened the stability of entire civilizations. The collapse of early agricultural societies often followed a predictable pattern. Initial success led to population growth and territorial expansion. Increased population density put pressure on local resources. Technological solutions temporarily masked the underlying problems while creating new dependencies. Eventually, the accumulated stresses exceeded the system's capacity to adapt, leading to rapid social and economic collapse. This pattern repeated itself across different regions and time periods with such regularity that some archaeologists began to wonder whether there was something inherent in agricultural thinking that made such collapses inevitable. The same cognitive abilities that allowed humans to modify their environments also seemed to make them vulnerable to overconfidence in their ability to control complex systems. The genetic evidence from this period reveals another dimension of the transformation. As human populations became larger and more sedentary, they also became more genetically diverse within local areas, but more similar across large regions. The constant movement and mixing that had characterized Ice Age populations gave way to more stable, local communities that nonetheless maintained long-distance connections through trade and intermarriage. This changing pattern of gene flow had important implications for human evolution. Beneficial genetic variants could now spread rapidly across large populations through trade networks and cultural exchange. But harmful variants could also become fixed in isolated communities that lacked sufficient genetic diversity to buffer against their effects. The result was an acceleration of human evolution, but in directions that were increasingly influenced by cultural rather than purely environmental factors. Genetic variants that enhanced social cognition language processing, and the ability to digest agricultural foods spread rapidly through farming populations. Meanwhile, variants that had been adaptive for Ice Age lifestyles became less common or disappeared entirely. This coevolution between cultural and biological change created feedback loops that accelerated the pace of human transformation. Cultural innovations created new selective pressures that favoured particular genetic variants. These genetic changes, in turn, made possible new forms of cultural complexity, which created even stronger selective pressures in the same direction. Within just a few thousand years, the humans who had emerged from the Ice Age had become something qualitatively different from their ancestors, not just in their technologies or social organizations, but in their fundamental cognitive and biological architecture. They were becoming a species adapted not to any particular natural environment, but to the artificial environments they were creating for themselves. This self-directed evolution represented something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. Never before had a species developed the ability to consciously modify its own evolutionary trajectory through cultural choices. The implications were staggering, both for human development and for the future of the planet itself. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transformation was how unconscious it was for the people living through it. Each generation made small adaptations to changing circumstances, never fully aware that they were participating in a fundamental reorganization of human nature itself. The cognitive revolution that was reshaping our species happened gradually, through millions of individual decisions that seemed rational and necessary at the time. The farmers who first began selectively breeding plants and animals weren't trying to transform human consciousness. They were simply trying to ensure more reliable food supplies for their families. The craftsmen who developed new technologies weren't attempting to accelerate cultural evolution. They were solving immediate practical problems. The leaders who organized increasingly complex social systems weren't consciously directing human development. They were responding to the challenges created by larger populations and more sophisticated technologies. Yet the cumulative effect of all these individual choices was a transformation so profound that it altered not just human societies, but the entire biosphere. The planet that Ice Age humans had inhabited as one species among many was becoming a world increasingly shaped by human decisions and human values. This transition from environmental adaptation to environmental manipulation marked a fundamental threshold in Earth's history. For the first time in 4 billion years of evolution, a single species had developed the cognitive tools necessary to deliberately modify the conditions of its own existence. The question that remained was whether this unprecedented power would be used wisely. The answer to that question was still being written in the choices being made by the descendants of Ice Age survivors as they spread across the warming continents, carrying with them the cognitive gifts and burdens that had been forged in humanity's longest, coldest night. Each new settlement, each technological innovation, each social experiment was adding another line to a story whose ending remained uncertain. What was clear was that there could be no return to the world that had existed before the ice. The cognitive revolution that had begun in the frozen camps of mammoth hunters had unleashed forces that would continue to reshape both human nature and planetary systems for millennia to come. The species that had once survived by adapting to their environment had become a force of environmental change itself. And in that transformation lay both the greatest promise and the greatest peril that life on Earth had ever faced. The same minds that could conceive of agriculture and civilization could also conceive of their own destruction. The same technologies that could support millions of people could also damage the ecological systems that all life depended on. The same social innovations that could create unprecedented cooperation could also create unprecedented conflict. The legacy of the Ice Age wasn't just the cognitive abilities that had allowed humans to survive Earth's last great climate crisis, it was the responsibility that came with those abilities. The burden of conscious choice in a world where every decision could have consequences that stretched across generations and around the globe. Human consciousness had been transformed by ice and time into something unprecedented in Earth's history. What remained to be seen was what that consciousness would choose to create with the power it had been given. The transformation that began in the ice wasn't just changing individual human lives, it was reshaping the very fabric of existence on Earth. And nowhere was this more evident than in the relationship between humans and the other species that shared their warming world. During the Ice Age, humans had been part of a complex web of predator and prey relationships that had evolved over millions of years. Mammoth herds thundered across the steppes in migrations that followed routes established long before the first human footsteps. Cave lions stalked through forests that had known their presence for countless generations. Giant ground sloths browsed in woodlands where their ancestors had fed since the dawn of the Pleistocene. But as the glaciers retreated and human populations grew more sophisticated, this ancient balance began to shift in ways that would prove irreversible. The same cognitive abilities that allowed humans to plan agricultural cycles and coordinate complex social activities also made them devastatingly effective hunters when they chose to be. The archaeological evidence from this period tells a story that is both fascinating and sobering. Across North America, Australia, and parts of Europe, the end of the Ice Age coincided with the extinction of most large mammal species. Not gradually, over millions of years, as had happened in previous extinction events, but rapidly, within just a few thousand years of human arrival or population expansion in each region. The timing is too precise to be coincidental. In Australia, giant kangaroos, enormous wombats, and predatory lizards the size of crocodiles all disappeared within a few thousand years of the first human settlements. In North America, mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and dozens of other large species vanished just as human populations were expanding across the continent. This wasn't simply a matter of humans hunting large animals to extinction, though that certainly played a role. It was something more subtle and more profound, the emergence of a species capable of modifying entire ecosystems through conscious decision-making. When humans began using fire as a landscape management tool, they weren't just clearing land for agriculture. They were fundamentally altering the vegetation patterns that supported complex food webs. When they began selectively hunting certain species while protecting others, they were reshaping predator-prey relationships that had been stable for millennia. When they began domesticating plants and animals, they were creating entirely new ecological relationships that had never existed in nature. The scale of this transformation becomes clear when we look at what happened to the grasslands that had supported Ice Age megafauna. The mammoth steppe, that vast ecosystem that had stretched from Western Europe to Alaska, didn't just disappear because the climate warmed. It disappeared because the large herbivores that had maintained it through their grazing patterns were no longer present in sufficient numbers. Without mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, and giant bison to keep the vegetation short and prevent tree growth, the grasslands began reverting to forest. This change happened remarkably quickly in geological terms, often within just a few centuries, and once the habitat was gone, any remaining large herbivores lost their food source and disappeared as well. The psychological implications of this transformation were as significant as the ecological ones. For the first time in human history, people were living in a world that was demonstrably different from the one their grandparents had known. The stories passed down through oral tradition spoke of animals that no longer existed, of landscapes that had vanished, of a time when the world had been fundamentally different. This created a new form of historical consciousness, an awareness that the present was not eternal, and that human actions could have consequences that extended far beyond individual lifespans. The same minds that could plan agricultural cycles began to grapple with the realization that they were living through changes that were reshaping the entire world. But perhaps most significantly, the end of the Ice Age marked the beginning of humanity's transition from being subject to natural selection to becoming an agent of selection for other species. The plants and animals that survived in the post-Ice Age world were increasingly those that could adapt to human-modified environments or that humans chose to protect and propagate. This transition accelerated as human societies became more complex and their environmental impact more extensive. The development of metallurgy led to more intensive mining, which altered local landscapes and water systems. The growth of cities created entirely artificial environments that nonetheless supported their own unique assemblages of plants and animals. The expansion of trade networks spread species far beyond their natural ranges, creating novel ecological communities that had never existed before. Within just a few millennia of the Ice Age's end, humans had become the dominant force shaping the evolution of life on Earth. Not through direct genetic manipulation, which would come much later, but through the systematic modification of environments and the conscious selection of which species would be allowed to thrive. This power came with responsibilities that most human societies were slow to recognize. The immediate benefits of environmental modification were obvious. More food, more security, more comfort. But the long-term consequences often took generations to become apparent, and by then the changes had become so deeply embedded in social and economic systems that reversing them seemed impossible. The civilizations that emerged in the millennia following the Ice Age can be understood as elaborate experiments in managing these new relationships between humans and the natural world. Some societies developed sophisticated systems of environmental stewardship that allowed them to maintain stability for thousands of years. Others pursued strategies of intensive exploitation that led to rapid growth followed by equally rapid collapse. But all of them were grappling with the same fundamental challenge: how to use the unprecedented cognitive abilities that had evolved during the Ice Age in ways that enhanced rather than undermined the long-term sustainability of human civilization. The genetic evidence from this period reveals that humans themselves were continuing to evolve in response to the new environments they were creating. Populations that had adopted agricultural lifestyles developed genetic variants that improved their ability to digest grains and dairy products. Urban populations evolved enhanced resistance to infectious diseases that thrived in crowded conditions. Groups that lived at high altitudes or in other challenging environments developed physiological adaptations that had never been needed during the Ice Age. But the most significant changes were happening not in human genes, but in human cultures. The cognitive abilities that had been forged during the Ice Age were being applied to increasingly abstract domains: mathematics, philosophy, art, religion, law. Each of these developments built on the foundational capacities for working memory, pattern recognition, and social learning that had been selected for during humanity's coldest millennia. The result was an explosion of cultural diversity that paralleled the biological diversity humans were simultaneously reducing through their environmental impact. Thousands of different languages, belief systems, artistic traditions, and social organizations emerged as human populations spread across the warming continents and adapted to local conditions. This cultural diversification created new forms of beauty and meaning that would have been impossible during the Ice Age. But it also created new sources of conflict as different human groups competed for resources and territory. The same cognitive abilities that made cooperation within groups more effective also made conflict between groups more devastating. The development of agriculture, metallurgy, and complex social organization gave some human societies enormous advantages over others. Groups that successfully adopted these innovations could support larger populations, develop more sophisticated technologies, and project power over greater distances. Those that didn't were often displaced, absorbed, or eliminated. This pattern of expansion and displacement accelerated as human societies became more complex and their technologies more powerful. By the end of the period we're examining, just a few thousand years after the Ice Age's end, human populations had spread to every habitable continent and were beginning to develop the technologies that would eventually allow them to modify the planet's climate itself. The transformation that had begun with small bands of Ice Age survivors learning to work together more effectively had become a force capable of reshaping the entire biosphere. The cognitive revolution that had started around campfires in frozen tundra was now driving changes that would be visible from space. Yet for all this dramatic transformation, the humans living through it remained fundamentally the same species that had survived the Ice Age. Their brains were still essentially Ice Age brains, adapted for life in small groups facing immediate physical challenges. Their emotional responses, social instincts, and cognitive biases were still those that had evolved during hundreds of thousands of years of hunter-gatherer existence. This mismatch between ancient psychology and modern challenges would become one of the defining features of human civilization. The same mental mechanisms that had promoted survival during the Ice Age often led to counterproductive behaviours in complex agricultural societies. The tendency to favour short-term rewards over long-term benefits, to trust in group members while being suspicious of outsiders, to make decisions based on emotional reactions rather than careful analysis, all of these had been adaptive during the Ice Age, but became sources of conflict and inefficiency in larger, more complex societies. Understanding this evolutionary mismatch became crucial for anyone trying to create stable, prosperous human communities. The most successful post-Ice Age societies were often those that found ways to channel ancient psychological tendencies toward constructive ends, rather than simply trying to suppress them. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this entire transformation was how it had emerged from such humble beginnings. The cognitive abilities that were now reshaping the planet had evolved not as grand adaptations to cosmic challenges, but as practical solutions to the immediate problems faced by small groups of humans trying to survive in a world of ice and scarcity. The working memory that could now encompass complex mathematical proofs had originally evolved to track the movements of animal herds across vast territories. The social learning abilities that were now transmitting sophisticated technologies across continents had originally developed to share information about food sources and survival techniques within small bands. The pattern recognition skills that were now revealing the hidden structures of the natural world had originally been used to read animal tracks in snow and mud. In every case, the magnificent achievements of post-Ice Age civilization had grown from the basic cognitive toolkit that had been assembled during humanity's struggle to survive Earth's last great climate crisis. The Ice Age hadn't just tested human adaptability, it had created the mental foundations for everything that would follow. And as we reach the end of our journey through this pivotal period in human history, perhaps the most important lesson is this. The same species that had once huddled around fires in Ice Age shelters, sharing stories and stone tools, had within just a few thousand years become capable of conscious, deliberate participation in its own evolution. The transformation from Ice Age survivors to agricultural civilizations wasn't just a change in lifestyle or technology, it was the emergence of a fundamentally new kind of consciousness, one capable of imagining futures that had never existed and working systematically to bring them into being. That consciousness, forged in ice and shaped by necessity, remains with us today. Every time we plan for tomorrow, cooperate with strangers, or try to understand the complex systems that surround us, we're using cognitive abilities that were refined during humanity's longest, coldest night. The Ice Age is over, but its legacy lives on in every human mind. We are all the descendants of those Ice Age survivors, carrying within us the same capacities for adaptation, cooperation, and innovation that allowed our ancestors to not just endure, but transform one of the most challenging periods in Earth's history. And perhaps that's the most hopeful message we can take from this ancient story. If a small population of Ice Age humans could develop the cognitive tools necessary to reshape an entire planet, then we who inherit those same tools might yet find ways to use them wisely, creating futures worthy of the extraordinary journey that brought us here. The last Ice Age ended 12,000 years ago, but the transformation it began in human consciousness continues today. We are still becoming, still evolving, still writing the next chapter of a story that began in firelight and continues beneath the stars. Human evolution didn't end when the ice melted. It simply changed direction, from adaptation to environment to adaptation through environment. And in that change lies both our greatest opportunity and our greatest responsibility as the inheritors of an Ice Age mind in a warming world. Thank you for taking this journey through deep time with me. Whether this helped you drift off to sleep, provided a companion for late night work, or simply offered a moment of wonder about our shared human story, I'm grateful you are here. If you found this exploration meaningful, consider sharing it with others who might appreciate this kind of thoughtful, evidence-based storytelling. And remember, we are all carriers of an ancient legacy, shaped by ice and time into something unprecedented in Earth's history. What we choose to do with that inheritance remains the most important question we face as a species. Sweet dreams, fellow descendants of the Ice Age. The story continues tomorrow.